Karen Elliott House, thanks for joining me on American Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.
So, you were the second woman hired in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Bureau. Then you rose to become its editor and publisher. Did you ever encounter moments of self-doubt or resistance? And if so, how did you handle that?
Yes, my first job at the Wall Street Journal was covering the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I knew absolutely nothing about financial filings. So I had to go every day and file for the ticker, the AP Dow Jones Newswire. And every single day at 1 o'clock, when I looked at the filings and spoke into the telephone, I was certain it would be my last day at Dow Jones because I would make some kind of mess. But I handled it by just going back day after day. And fortunately, I never messed up, and I lived to get a job that didn't frighten me as much.
And then you got to travel with
covering energy, by the way, which is when I got my interest in Saudi Arabia, obviously in 1974 after the embargo. I got moved from this frightening job at the Securities and Exchange Commission to covering energy for the Wall Street Journal.
Correct. And you worked also as a diplomatic correspondent.
Yeah, after 3 years of energy, then diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. So among the many influential figures you've met, who surprised you the most with their actions or words?
What surprised me the most with what?
So among the figures you've met, I know you, for example, met King Hussein, you met, probably you traveled with Kissinger and other officials. So like, who surprised you the most with their actions or words among world leaders?
Probably Saddam Hussein. I met with him right before the invasion of Kuwait, 6 weeks before. And I had tried for 3 years to get an interview with him. And it's in Baghdad in his palace office. And he stood down a red carpet that to me looked like 100 yards long. It wasn't that long, and I had to walk, shake his hand in front of a TV camera. And the thing that was astounding to me, given that Arabs are always so hospitable, and I had known King Hussein, who couldn't, he couldn't be kind enough to you when you went to interview him. And Saddam Hussein, to my great pleasure, spent 3 hours answering my questions until I literally ran out. But never in 3 hours did he offer an Arabic coffee, a cup of tea, a glass of water, orange juice, nothing. And it wasn't during Ramadan either. So I didn't know if I was supposed to think, if this was deliberate. He didn't have anything either. So it's not like he discriminated against me, but it was just very strange to meet an Arab leader or any leader, because I met the leader of Poland, Jaruzelski, and, people try to pretend, at least, that they're great Democrats and they like people, and so they give you water or flowers or something to be friendly. And Saddam Hussein wanted you to think he was the meanest man you had ever met, and I did think he was the meanest man I'd ever met.
And you said you met him 6 weeks before the invasion, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And did you see any signs that?
No, I clearly missed it, because he said at one point, his main message in this interview, and probably the reason he gave it, was, that because there'd been a lot of talk about him striking Israel, and, and nuclear weapons, trying to get them. So his main point was, I'm not going to do anything to Israel unless they do something to me. And, as the interview went on into the Arab, relations, etc., I mean, he did say at one point something about my friends in the region who can't see beyond their noses, meaning the Saudis and others who were pressing him to repay the money that they had loaned him. But I wasn't smart enough to pick up on it. I didn't have any idea that. I thought he was trying to signal he's not going to whack anybody. And instead, he was just signaling, I think, because he intended to enter Kuwait, that the Israelis can stand aside. They're not my target. But I wasn't smart enough to get his message. But the American diplomats that talked to him at the same time weren't smart enough to figure it out either. So I feel less stupid as a result.
And when he accepted this interview for Wall Street Journal, did he want? Do you think he had some message that he wanted to send to the Western world?
Yeah, I think he was trying to signal the Western world that he wasn't going to do anything to Israel, and that he in essence didn't have malevolent intentions, as people were fearful of. But again, it was a very they took everything from me. Before I went to see him, they took my tape recorder, my pen, my notebook, everything. And it was given back to me when I was seated beside him. They didn't take any chances on me having a poison pen or anything. And indeed, when I asked to go to the restroom in the wait before the interview, someone escorted me in and out. I mean, they kept me, under constant surveillance to make sure that, I'd been to Iraq before and had, met Tariq Aziz a number of times. So, they should have known I wasn't a CIA agent. I don't know, but, they kept a close eye on me. It was all a very interesting experience. And when I asked him at the very end, what do you do to relax? He had a wall of military men behind him, and he looked to them and spoke in Arabic. And sadly, I don't speak Arabic, but the translator told me later that they said to him, tell her you go fishing. And he said to me, again, according to the translator, I don't relax. Wow. But everything in the interview, he let me go on for 3 hours, which I truly appreciated. But he did not make any of the normal efforts that any other leader I've ever met in the world, Israeli, Saudi, Syrian, American, Brazilian, etc. No effort to charm you or to be gracious.
Mm-hmm. So interviewing late Jordan's king, King Hussein, was an important moment in your career. What was the most challenging part of those interviews you've done with him? And was there anything about King Hussein that caught you off guard?
No, he was just, I repeat, the most gracious man. Those interviews lasted over a 6-week period before he finally said to President Reagan, I can't participate in your peace plan. So I went with him to India, to the non-aligned meeting. I went with him to London to see Mrs. Thatcher. He had a slight heart attack and went into the hospital. I went to his son's third or fourth birthday. And at the birthday party, it was all women, like 13, roughly a dozen Jordanian women and their children, and me and his wife, Queen Noor. And it got cold as evening came, and he went into the house and brought out for every woman a shawl to wrap up in. I mean, he was just always gracious and solicitous, and and in an interview, very he was kind, and he exuded sort of kindness and compassion in the way he talked about people, with the one exception of Chairman Arafat. He didn't seem so kind toward him because he wanted Arafat to agree to allow him to represent the Palestinians, and Arafat avoided him for most of those 6 weeks, then finally came and said no to him. And so he said no to President Reagan. But, he was, that didn't surprise me because I had seen him earlier times. I had been there trying to see him in 1978 when I first became diplomatic correspondent. And he was getting engaged to Lisa Halaby, who became Queen Noor. And I got invited, as did the other press, to the engagement announcement. And again, he was so nice to his fiancée, and he spoke so kindly about her. So I mean, I knew he was not a harsh man, but the 6 weeks of following him and his agreeing at about 4 days into that, I said to him, if you will just tell me what's really going on, I won't write until I can write why you said yes or why you said no to Ronald Reagan about joining his peace plan. And so he agreed, and he took out his letter that President Reagan had written him and showed it to me. And I prayed for a photographic memory, which I don't have, but and then I got him to show it to me again. But it was a really fascinating experience to see somebody under pressure. He met with the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Syrians, all kinds of people at the non-aligned, and in subsequent time back in Jordan, the Russians came to see him. Prince Bandar, who was then the ambassador to the U.S. from Saudi, came. But it was really fascinating to hear and see in real time. And I was able to talk to the people he talked to because they didn't know I was talking to him. So you didn't have to reconstruct what they wished they had said or thought they had said. You heard what they said at the time. So it was a very fascinating reporting experience.
Amazing. So Saudi Arabia is an important part of your career. You've immersed yourself in Saudi in ways few Western and American journalists have done. Coming from a tiny town in Texas, Matador, what originally drew you to Saudi Arabia?
I went originally, I wasn't drawn, I was told to go. Right after Sadat went to Jerusalem in November of 1977, I became the diplomatic correspondent for the Journal in January of 1978. So the foreign editor of the paper told me, go to Saudi, Syria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan. These are the countries you're going to be writing about. Just go visit them all. So I did. I landed in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah was taken to Zaki Yamani's house to a dinner party of men and women. A country was nothing like it in 78, like it became after the 79 revolution in Iran. And I was just very fascinated by the people in the country, because Saudis, my first impression was they're very hospitable, nice people. And religion didn't scare me, because having grown up in Matador, as you said, it was a town of 900 people, and there was nothing in town to do except go to church. There were 5 churches actually, for 900 people. So that's what we did. We went to church, and my father was very strict: no shorts, no pants, like a Saudi, nothing that reveals the body. I mean, we were allowed to wear sleeveless dresses, but no shorts, no pants, no alcohol. So I felt quite at home in Saudi Arabia. And then I got quite fascinated by Islam, because religion as a whole interests me. And everybody I met in Saudi Arabia gave me a Quran. So I had lots of Qurans, and I asked for what's the best English translation. And a professor in England actually told me what one to get. But I used to carry then, I got all these little Qurans from Saudis in English and in Arabic, but I always carried the English ones that I could read.
Great. And also, you've said, being a woman sometimes gave you an advantage in Saudi in terms of like access. You could talk with men, you could talk to women and families. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I mean, everybody would ask me, aren't you afraid to be in Saudi Arabia? And of course, the answer to that was no. There wasn't a lot. There was a far more crime in the United States than in Saudi Arabia. And how can you function as a woman? And I believe firmly that it was an advantage, because certainly after the country became more conservative, after the Iranian Revolution, I could talk to men, because Saudi officials were men, and they were willing to meet with you. And I even managed to see some of the senior religious officials, which I assumed wouldn't talk to a woman, but they did. And yet I could see women, and your male reporter counterparts rarely could see women, certainly people's wives and families, because it was very frowned upon. So I really loved being able to sit with the men and Jason with the governor and his men, and then go the next day to the orange orchard with the women and all of the.
You went to Jason.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, I got to go to every province in Saudi Arabia. And that was also interesting, because Saudis in those days didn't travel very much, unless they traveled out of Saudi Arabia. They didn't really go around their own country. So, people would talk to you, and you'd say something about Jason. Oh, have you been there? I've never been there. You've been to Farazan Island? I've never been there. I mean, it just lots of, I loved getting around the country. And now you can go places that I was not permitted to go in those days. I wanted to go to Jebel Lows, and because somebody had told me that was the real Mount Sinai. And, it was just, no, we don't want any Christians talking about things like that. We don't want anybody going. And now, of course, tourism is one of the big efforts that the Crown Prince is making. So I've been to Jebel now and Al Ula and Hegra and all of those places that used to be more off limits.
Great. Well, I'm glad that you had the chance to do that. So in 2022, the US-Saudi relations, hit its lowest point probably since in 50 years. There were lots of media clashes, but all of a sudden, President Biden made the decision. He went to Jeddah, met with the king, with the crown prince. What do you think caused this shift in his policy?
Oil prices and the election. I mean, he as I think I wrote at the time, he planned to humble the crown prince, and the crown prince humbled him. I mean, he went there, as you know, to ask for more oil production to try to bring down the prices. And the crown prince just said no. But it was, I think, purely about oil. And then he, got the message and stopped trying to proudly isolate the crown prince as a pariah, and all that's happened since of the talk about a security arrangement between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. and recognition of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But he wanted something for himself and his party.
So now the Saudi-US relationship, has been recently, seen as part of the great power competition. And I want to ask you, how do you think the Crown Prince Mohammed and Salman now envision Saudi Arabia's relationship with the US, with Russia, with China?
I think he understands that the U.S. is the best possible ally he could have. But given our unreliability, he has obviously chosen to expand his circle of friends to include China, which is the biggest buyer of Saudi oil, so that relationship makes economic sense. And Russia, he needs Russia to cooperate on oil production because, as you know, Saudi and the Russians have had their differences on oil, and the Saudis opened the floodgates, and when the Russians wouldn't cut and dragged the price way down. So there's a reason for that cooperation. I think there is, to me, less in that for Saudi Arabia because Putin is not nearly as powerful as he thinks, in my view. And he's hanging on too long as a ruler, so that I don't think he's doing his country any favors. So if I were a head of state, I would be somewhat wary of my relations with Putin.
Great. And for the region, I'm sure you followed the news. What do you think of what's going on for you? You've been touring this region for decades, and now it's in fire. How do you envision the Middle East?
I must say, being a Bible reader and a Quran reader, I think that the Middle East is going to be always troubled. I hate to say that, but That's history. History bears that out. It's just, this having a Saudi-Israeli diplomatic relations makes so much sense economically, commercially, politically, militarily. But I don't think it would solve all the problems. I mean, the Iranians obviously wouldn't like it, and how you get Iran contained. Regime change in Iran, which Netanyahu seems to be saying is imminent, and addressing the Iranian people, etc. I fear that if the Israelis choose to really be aggressive in responding to Iran, that instead of making the Iranian people more willing to rise up and get rid of their leadership, it could have the opposite effect.
I want to ask you about the conference, but before that, I want to ask you about the meeting you had with his father, King Salman, in 2010, I believe, when he was governor of Riyadh. What stood out to you from that meeting?
The thing that, that impressed me the most, and that I found most interesting, was just the king saying, we can't have democracy here because we have many tribes, and every tribe would be a party, and we would have chaos. And so we consult and then with people, and then we decide. It was a good description of the way I think Saudi Arabia works.
And in 2016, I believe you met with the Crown Prince. Can you tell me more about that encounter?
The first time I met him, in 2016, I was impressed by his informality. He was bareheaded, and and kind of his exuberant confidence. He shakes your hand, and throughout, even though he had a translator, he was constantly correcting the translator's translation. So it was clear that he spoke a good bit of English, and occasionally he would just speak English. But since that meeting, in subsequent meetings, he has spoken English, and his English is very good.
And are you working on a book about him?
I am working on a book about him. Yes. I'm trying to, essentially write about what shaped the man who is reshaping Saudi Arabia. Because to me, he's not like any other Saudi I've ever met. He's much more willing to stand out, to stand apart, to be different, to be controversial. I mean, most, Americans love to stand out, to be different, the way they dress or what they say, or, all of to excess. And, most Saudis that I've met are very aware of not bringing shame on themselves or their family, or not standing out, but blending in until they know you better, at least. And he's just very confident, and I'm not at all, that I can see, bothered by having a different position from someone else, or and yet he can explain why he thinks what he thinks. I mean, he's in my view, incredibly intelligent and articulate, and confident and risk-taking.
Well, for the Crown Prince book, I would really appreciate if you could share like any sneak peeks or major themes you're exploring in that book.
Well, I'm just trying to show him. I mean, I tried to persuade him to let me do what I did with King Hussein, just literally follow him around for a period of time and be able to watch him in action and see him do things over a prolonged period. He never did that, you know what I mean? I've not been able to trail him around for days or weeks on end. But he is willing to talk, and I mean, I hopefully the book is going to be out in the spring. I'll make sure you get a copy. You can read it. You can interview me again, and I'll tell all my stories about him.
Amazing. I'd love that. I'd love that.